everybody, Chef Kristina here. We are having our first sunny day, if you can believe it, here in Southern California in about a week. And as I was going through our rainy day week, I realized that I was out of a key recipe that is always in my refrigerator. And I thought you might be interested in learning how to do my signature bone broth. This was something that we did at my restaurant, Rest Farmhouse Inspired, when we had that here. And everybody told me no matter what they put in their bone broth at home, theirs didn't taste exactly like mine. So for all of my beautiful Rest customers out there, this one is for you. Okay, so why are we even making bone broth? I mean, you can go buy it, right? You can go buy stock or broth at the grocery store, but you can't really buy bone broth. Now, there's an exception to the rule. There are a lot of companies now who are putting some quality bone broth out on the market, but it's not the same as what you can make at home. So I always make mine at home. And it's really important, I think, to know why we're doing it. And so let's talk about that for a second. My grandmother was one of my role models in the kitchen. She just knew what kept me well. Now, I would say probably for most of us, we have to go back several generations, maybe to our great-great-great-grandparents before we really get to that wealth of knowledge that would have been passed down from generation to generation in regards to foods and what foods actually healed our bodies. And I would argue that science wasn't there yet. They didn't know why the food was so healing, but they just did. And so in times of viruses or plagues or, people just aren't feeling well, it's tummy bugs, whatever it is, moms throughout generations would have made bone broth. And they're using the bones that would have been thrown away, right? So for mine, I'm using backs, necks, feet. I know you're kind of freaking out. Trust me. And I always use pasture-fed or pastured free-range chicken or organic chicken. I actually get this from my butcher, who bags it up beautifully in these about 3-pound bags. And the feet, I know. Actually, when I first started making bone broth, I was like, there's no way I'm going to use feet. But they're the best part. They have the most collagen in them. So we're using bones because we want to pull the minerals, right? The calcium, the phosphorus, the collagen, everything from that super nutrient dense bone, we want to actually leach out into our broth, which is why it's so important to get pastured or organic bones, okay? Don't just go and buy, I'm not even gonna say the brands that pop into my mind, but don't go buy industrial chicken and then use those bones, okay? Because what you're getting in those bones, you don't want. So organic or pastured only. All right, so we're using all organic ingredients. I have a couple stalks of celery, we have carrots, we have garlic, an entire bulb, trust me on that, an onion, we have Himalayan pink salt, peppercorns. I like the variety that has a bunch of different color ones. We have bay leaves. This is an interesting, and this is key ingredient here, folks. This is an acid. It's apple cider vinegar. Super important to help break down the bones and draw out the minerals. And then lastly, we have dried shiitake mushrooms. Okay, now I will tell you, for my beautiful Rest customers, I didn't put shiitake mushrooms in my broth. This is a new addition. So everything up to this point was what exactly I had in my bone broth at the restaurant. But because of the viral threat that our world is under right now, I'm looking for foods that are adaptogenic, okay? And all that means is those particular foods have properties in them that help us adapt to the stresses either environmentally or that we're putting in ourselves, stress, right? We're all kind of a little more uptight, a little more anxious right now, perhaps. So we're looking to add foods that help us to adapt to that maybe higher stress environment. So this is something that I really recommend doing, but it's not necessary, okay, to get an amazing deep bone broth flavor. And actually, there's another little trick. If you can't put 3 pounds of bones in your broth, add dried mushrooms every time. It adds kind of that umami flavor, and it will deepen the depth of flavor profile of your broth, okay? So I'm gonna start with getting these bones in the pot. Okay, I've got my bones in the pot, and now I'm gonna add in my mushrooms, peppercorns, my vinegar, bay leaves. Remember, I don't measure, so I'm gonna go for maybe a tablespoon of salt right now. I don't actually make my broth very salty. I want to be able to flavor it in whatever I'm using it in, but I do want a little bit of salt in there. Whole onion. It can't be any more simple than this, folks. I leave the wrappers, everything on, just drop it in. My whole bowl of garlic, wrappers, the whole thing, just drop it in. Okay, and then for my carrots, maybe I'll trim the ends off if they look like they need it. And get those tips off into the pot. And my celery, just trim the ends barely. Into the pot we go. Okay, so I've got everything in the pot. You can see it here. Nothing fancy, right? This is super easy. Generally, when I'm not talking to people, this takes me maybe 5 minutes to put together. Now I'm adding my filtered water. Okay, again, if you have filtered water, which you should, none of us should be using tap water. Thank you very much. We don't need any fluoride in our food or in our water that we're putting in our bodies. So I just put in a pitcher of water. You know, the water isn't an exact science. Basically fill your pot until you've got everything kind of covered. Turn the stove on, crank it up. Boy, do I miss my restaurant stove that had way more BTUs than my home stove, but you know, you work with what you got, right? So I've got this cranked up. We're gonna let it go, bring it up to a full boil, and then we'll begin to skim off the fat. Okay, y'all, I said fat, but I actually meant foam. So you can see how I've brought the whole pot up to a boil, and there's this foam that's on the top of it. And I just want to barely skim that off. Okay, foam is just an indicator of impurities. And so I'll be completely honest with you. Sometimes I'm lazy about getting this foam off. I haven't died yet. But for you purists out there who can't let something like this go, this is your moment, okay? You're just skimming off the fat. If you were to make this broth in an Instant Pot or in a slow cooker, neither one of those would give you an opportunity to get the foam. So this really is only if you're bringing it up to a boil on the stove top. Okay, so we've skimmed off the foam, and I'm just going to reduce this down to super low. Okay, basically I want it at barely a simmer, maybe just like one bubble every minute or so. And I'm going to let that go on my stovetop. Now, if you're uncomfortable with that, use the Instant Pot or the slow cooker. If you have questions, just message me. But basically, I'm just going to leave it exactly like it is. It's going to come down in temperature. I'm going to take mine and move it to the back burner, which is actually a burner that is for simmering, so that it's the lowest possible temperature on my stove. And I'm going to leave it sitting there overnight. So this broth is going to go, see, it's 12:40 here, California time. It's going to go until at least tomorrow morning, if not around lunchtime. So a good solid amount of time. Generally, I like my chicken broth to go 12 to 24 hours. And if it's beef or if it's beef, it's gonna go much longer than that. But that'll be another video. So when we come back tomorrow, I'll show you how to pour this off and get it into jars, which is my favorite way of storing it. And I'll show you what real bone broth should look like when it's cooled down. See you then. Okay, so I wanted you to get a good shot of the level of flame that I had this broth going with. After we had it up at a boil, we skimmed the foam, and then I told you to bring the temperature way down to barely a simmer. That's where it's been for about 24 hours now. So I wanted you to make sure you get to see that. And then this is our finished product. This beautiful dark golden brown broth. Okay, so we've moved over here to the sink, and I wanted to show you just a couple things that I have for the moment when we're gonna pour our bone broth off. I have a giant glass measuring cup, I guess. Just as I'm pouring, it might get a little messy, so I put it in the sink, save some mess. I have a fine mesh strainer, easy for me to say. This is really important because, you know, we're gonna have debris from where the bones have kind of broken down, and your extra spices, you don't want to come across a peppercorn. Remember, we used whole peppercorns in this. So I use a strainer to pour off the broth. And then I have some mason jars that once I get it poured off, I'll store my broth in those. And I mean, if you want to use a ladle and you don't want to just start pouring like I do, do it. Whatever makes you most comfortable, okay? You can ladle your broth through the strainer. That's totally fine. But, you know, like I don't measure, I just cut to the chase and go for it, okay? Be brave. Et voila! We have our bone broth. So I used my first big giant measuring cup and then my second one. Like, you can use a bowl, whatever you have. It doesn't have to be a measuring cup. But the reason that I like these is because it makes it so much easier to then come back and pour it into my mason jars. You know, I'm a big fan of mason jars because you can just reuse them over and over and over again, and they can take hot liquids and you don't have to worry about it. I expect that we'll get probably 5 quarts from this batch of bone broth, which is pretty good. And honestly, you can freeze this. If you do, leave extra room in your mason jar so that it doesn't crack. Or once it's cool, you can pour it into a Ziploc, lay it flat. Once it's sealed, make sure it's sealed, and then lay it in your freezer. Once it's frozen, you can stack it up and it saves a whole bunch of space in your freezer. And once it's in the freezer, you know, give it 2 or 3 months and you can pull it out as you need it. Another favorite trick is to freeze bone broth in an ice cube tray and then pop out the ice cubes. Again, put it in a Ziploc bag. You can use those to flavor rice or vegetables, you know, whatever you want. Or even make yourself a cup of broth, right? But for us, we're kind of crazy. I probably won't freeze this. With our 5 quarts, we'll probably make it the whole week with this. And that's great. 7 days, as long as you use it in 7 days, it's perfectly fine. We're kind of bone broth fanatics around here, so we'll definitely do that, especially if I make a soup, right? So I hope you enjoy this. Go home. You are home. We're all sheltering in place. Where else would you be? Get some organic pastured bones, make your bone broth. Rest customers, I hope you enjoy this.